Hello and welcome to the European Resilience Initiative Centre video podcast. Today our guest is Olena Snigyr. She is a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies in the European University in Florence, Italy. Welcome, Olena.
Hi, thanks for the invitation.
My first question is on your study you have published recently on strategic narratives of the Russian foreign policy. You have observed this situation for years. Can you see any system behind these narratives, or do the Russians act like ad hoc in any situation?
There is definitely a system, and what I tried to do in my research is to identify this system and the strategic narratives. What Russians are saying, but mostly about what they are doing, about their strategic plans and about their vision of future. Strategic narratives is a rather new concept in international relations theory, and it's situated on the cross-disciplinary spot between discourse studies and international relations theories, but also we can speak about memory studies and about history and about many other like linguistics and some other fields of academia. My aim was actually to find out, and maybe to prove, but actually to find out if Russians really think what they speak, or as you said, if it's all ad hoc and they invented all and adapt their policy according the situation. Yes, the Russian foreign policy is very adaptable and adaptive, but about the strategic narratives, there is definitely a system. So,
but if I may interrupt you here. Mm-hmm. We have seen that Russia tries to convince the whole world for months that they are for peace, they are for equality in the diplomatic relations, they are for all good things, and they repeatedly violate the very basic rules of the international law and of the human rights of everything. How do they get away with that?
Yeah, that's the question, how they sell. So if we have a look at the system of Russian strategic narratives, we will see that there are three main strategic narratives. One which applies to international system narratives, and this Russian narrative is that the international order is changing, and the West, or the liberal world, is trying to preserve its hegemony. So this is how Russians see this world right now. And the most important is that Russians are explaining this narrative to their allies, or to the international audience, or to the actors globally in the world. So we all agree actually that international order is changing, and that's true. But the thing is, what is inside this narrative, what they put in it. So the sub-narrative or the meso-narrative is that first, the subjection of Europe or European state, that the European state are not independent, are not sovereign, and they're totally dependent on the US in their politics. So there is nobody actually, according to Russian narrative, to speak to in Europe, but any problems or any issues with Europeans you have, or Russians have, firstly decide or solve with the Americans. The second sub-narrative is the conflict of values, and actually this is very interesting and very important narrative because it's existential narrative, and this narrative it's the frame for the whole Russian, I would say, a new ideology which is right now being reinvented. And the third one is that Russia is leader of the illiberal world. So the world is changing, and Russia is the leader of a liberal world. These things are quite like you hear them every day. And if you ask people from countries in Asia or in Latin America or in Africa or even some Europeans, they would agree with you that the world is changing and Russia is fighting with the US as a dominant power of the liberal world to make some changes. Yeah, but the thing is, what is packed inside of this? Second level of sub-narratives, which explains, in terms of which Russia explains the war with Ukraine. And there, Russia represents itself as a victim of the West, as I would say, as an eternal victim of the West. So Russians actually, they put all blame on the West for all their failures. There is the denial of sovereignty and identity of Ukraine, and this narrative corresponds very much to the narrative that I mentioned before, the subjection of Europe or European states. And this actually is very interesting, and I would like to come back later to it more, because when Russia is trying to legitimize its aggressive policy toward any other state, first thing that Russia is doing is questioning their identity and subjectivity of that state. So that Russia says, no, the state is not sovereign, people are literally occupied by other global powers and they cannot decide, they do not have their own will and they cannot decide for their future. So we can, want, and must liberate them.
That is exactly what the Russians always do. They always liberate you. They came with the liberation in 1968 to Czechoslovakia, back then to Prague. They came as liberators against the fascist uprising or some fascist mutiny in Hungary in 1956. They came as liberators to Ukrainian Donbass. They always come as liberators. The problem is why they, after that, start to execute people and bring them to the gulags.
It's it's not in their narrative. Why? They do not explain it. It's the other issue. Yeah. So it's the question. I will speak about it later a bit. But coming back to liberation, and I would say here the protection, because one people they have to liberate, other people they have to protect, or they have to protect. It's the other narrative, another one. In this group, another narrative, sub-narrative, is the protection of people who belong to Russian world. And here I would like to stop on a very interesting detail. According to the Russian law, those people who belong to Russian world are those who lived during the Soviet Union, in frames of Soviet Union, who were the citizens of Soviet Union, who were born in the Soviet Union, and the descendants of those who have been living or were born or actually belong to the sphere or the territory of Russian Empire and Soviet Union. So you can just imagine how many people can hypothetically be included in this imagined Russian world, which Russia demands is to be protected by the Russian state. If Russian state is asked for the protection, so it reminds me also a kind of this association with a vampire. Yeah, you have to invite a vampire into your house. He cannot come himself. I would also mention that not only Soviet Union but also Russian Empire, and the borders of Russian Empire were much bigger.
It is Finland and Alaska at least, and Poland, parts of Poland.
Part of Poland, yes, and those also people who may have emigrated abroad, but still consider them Russian or belong to, or that they belong to Russian culture or have some connections with Russian culture. So Russia feels like and demands that it has the right to protect their interests also. So it's rather broad concept. The issue with Russian narratives and with Russian concept is that they are very blurred. They do not have clear frames, so that the frames can be changed all the time, and the conditions can be changed all the time according to and can be interpreted differently according to Russian capabilities, I would say. So that if Russia feels that it can do it, then they will create necessary background and necessary platform and necessary frames to do it. And you also mentioned, when you spoke about Hungary in 1952, you mentioned fascist. Yes, so it's another, like, that Russians were liberating Hungary. That there was this narrative that Russians were liberating Hungary and Czechoslovakia from influence of fascists and Nazis. So this narrative is also eternal, actually, in Russian political view, and it also belongs to this second-level sub-narratives group, and it sounds like war with hairs of Nazis. So literally, any Russian adversary can be presented as a descendant or heir of Nazis.
Indeed, that was what they did, what they tried to do with Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, who is of a Jewish heritage, whose part of his ancestors have been literally killed by the German Nazis in the Holocaust. But the Russians picture him, a Jewish president of a democratic Ukraine, as a Nazi, which is quite ridiculous. Before we go deeper and before we continue this discussion on Russian narratives and who buy and spread them in the West, don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel. And if you have any ideas, then leave a comment under this video. We're talking with Olena Snigyr, who is a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies in the European University in Florence, Italy. Olena, you have already mentioned this comprehensive system of the Russian narratives, that Russia is for peace, Russia is fighting against the Nazis, and you already mentioned that there is a continuation, some sort of stability in these narratives. Can you explain what groups in the West and in other countries buy which narratives at most? Like, what narratives are bestsellers in this Russian politics?
Definitely. So I mentioned already the conflict of values narrative. And there is another group of narratives in this system of Russian strategic narratives, which is called issue narratives, and it explains how Russia sees the future world. And here, the most interesting, to my mind, narrative is the rights of illiberal regimes, or supremacy of the state sovereignty of the human rights. When Russia proposes, they call it democratization of international relations, and they propose to fix the principle, or to change the hierarchy of values, and to fix the principle of impunity of state regimes, of different political regimes, and equality of different political regimes on the international arena, despite how these regimes behave with their own citizens. And that means that no sanctions can be taken against these regimes, and no boycotts, no isolation, nothing at all. So literally it means that, for example, Germany and North Korea can have equal, they would have equal rights on the international arena, and the international system, the system of international relations, and North Korea can in no way be somehow limited in its policy. This narrative is strongly connected to the narrative conflict of values, and here this is a very important narrative, actually, and the main one, I would say, though it is in the level of sub-narratives. But Russia possesses itself as a leader, as I mentioned, of a liberal world, and Russia says, fine, there are liberal values which we think are hostile to traditional societies with their own traditional values. These liberals are toxic and they ruin the societies from inside. So we have to protect the societies with traditional values, and these societies and the states with these traditional values, like authoritarian or dictatorship, like Taliban, for example, it can be from the Russian point of view, it is the society, it is the country with traditional values which may conduct any policy inside without any judgment from outside, from other international actors. And Russia says that it's fine, it's okay, it's this regime and this country with this regime is to be protected, and by Russians also. Russia will lead the international illiberal movement to protect the rights of these regimes. So because Russians then they go further and they say that liberal values, they ruin actually humanity and they ruin human nature, and that liberal values are to be conquered, and that the future world is to be reconstructed on the principles where liberal values, well, Russians do not say that the liberal values should be demolished, but they mean it actually when they say that there can be no compromise in this contest between traditional societies with traditional values and societies with liberal values. So yes, this narrative about maybe it sounds a bit messy, but this narrative about the rights of liberal regimes and the rights, the protection of traditional societies with traditional values is very attractive by all authoritarian regimes, for all authoritarian regimes, and for those politicians who may take it as an excuse for actions against democracy.
But what is the motivation of not so few Western experts in international relations? Like we have seen recently a book published by Jean Monnet, who was a long year a supporter of Vladimir Putin's way of thinking. And we know that this book has been funded by a grant from the Valdai Club, Moscow organized club for friendly Western politicians and experts. But is it only about money when people fund your book and you publish whatever they want, or is there something attractive for people like Mishheimer and others in this Russian way of thinking?
It's a good question, and if I could enter the brain of Mishheimer, I probably would find the answer there, but I cannot, luckily. I would also like to refer here to a recent publication of a sociological research of European Council on Foreign Relations. The authors are Timothy Garton-Ash, Ivan Krastev, and Mark Leonard, living in an a la carte world, what European policymakers should learn from global public opinion. So it's about global public opinion. I would like to cite one thing, that the appeal of Western countries and values demonstrated in this poll often does not translate into support of Western policies. So people around the world, they find Western style of life and Western values very attractive, but at the same time they're trying to take advantage of what is happening right now in the world, of this world turbulence. They do not understand, they do not see the connection. That if you want to have and to support this style of life and to enjoy this comfort and stability and security, you also have to adhere to these values practically, to support these values and to live accordingly to these values, but not just to enjoy their preference, like the the conditions that these societies create, the liberal societies create. So people do not see the connection mainly. And I don't know whose fault is this. Maybe it's the fault actually also of those mass media who failed to explain people globally the connection between values, between a system of values and the style of living and the practical things that you do every day. So coming back to these international realist theories, I would say that there are Putin-verstehers, and there can be many, there can be different motivation of such people, such representatives of academia. And it's really very difficult. For many years, Russia was very successful to influence Western academia also. There were many programs supported by Russian government, also by by the Western governments to establish contacts, academia contacts between Russians and the Westerners, and these programs, they gave their results, but not the results that the Western society expected probably, but the results favorable for Russians, because the whole world, what we see now, is very the approach in the academia is still very Russo-centric, and it has to be changed. Some people from academia, they managed to do it, like Karl Schlögl from Germany, the German historian who has grown up and advanced in the sphere of Russian studies, but then he realized that his prism was a bit wrong, and he managed to change it. And he should be an example for many others, but for many people it's still very difficult, because it means that they have to revision and rethink all their academic background, and it's really hard. So it's understandable, and it's not a process of one day or of 1 year even. It's a process of changing the approach. I would say it's a process of decolonization of Western academia studies and Western academic discourse according East Europe and Eurasia as a whole. I think I will stop here.
But you have already talked about different narratives which Russia spreads, and one is self-victimization and saying, okay, I'm an eternal victim of the evil West. Then another narrative is this idea that is being addressed towards the potential allies. Look, if you side us, we can promote the idea that you can do whatever you want. Creation of some sort of an alliance of the dictators. But what do Russians offer to the elites of the countries which they try to influence within the European Union? Are there some different narratives, or do they come with the same toolbox?
Right now I can speak about general toolbox, like a general frame. Coming to different regions and to different target audiences of Russian propaganda, because Russian propaganda is based on these narratives. It's another research topic actually. What Russia is telling to different elites in different countries, and I would say in different continents, on different political sides. So. I'm not ready to say what Russia is proposing to European elites. I may just guess that probably some of Europeans just use this opportunity, as I said, they try to take the advantage of this chaotic period and turbulence, and to use it in their own political game. But right now I'm making a research on Russian strategic narratives or Russian propaganda. It's not the same, by the way, but it's quite close in Africa. So what Russia serves for African countries, and it's and especially my attention right now, and then next my short publication will be soon available in Ukrainian and then a bit later in English. It's about Russian Orthodox Church in Africa. As I see it, that Russian government mobilized Russian Orthodox Church for the war with the West in Africa, and it looks like it's quite effective, and it proposes the same tool, but it focuses actually on traditional values again. But here we can speak about it. The box of traditional values is packed in the paper of family values, and protection of family. And the second thing which is being promoted by Russia for African for African societies, is this issue that Russia is liberating them again from Western neocolonialism, as Soviet Union helped them during the 20th century process of decolonization. So so Russia again is saving people now in Africa from the evil West and from toxic liberal values, of course, and from Western neocolonialism. And this is quite attractive for African societies, by the way. This is quite successful strategy of Russian propaganda in Africa. I wouldn't say that they trust them completely, because we see the results in the UN. It's like Russia is not a winner in Africa right now, and I hope it will not be, but it tries, really fights hard for Africa. So I would say that for African countries, their trauma of colonialism is really, really deep and really, really painful still. And this is the very fruitful field for Russians, of course. But here we may invite to the table of negotiations with Africans those representatives of peoples of Russian Federation right now, who were colonized by Russian state, by Moscow, by Russian Empire, and who experienced genocide by Russians, and who suffered and still suffer, because this phase, the face of Russian imperialism and the face of Russian colonialism, is not so popular in Africa. African people do not know about Russia as about colonial state. Speaking to African societies, we have to remember that they actually fought for freedom, and they struggled for freedom and fought for freedom, and they wanted this liberty and these rights. And I'm not sure that I think that here we can find this common platform and understanding of each other, that it wouldn't be not fair, but it wouldn't be honest if they choose as an ally the power which still tries to perceive or uses or has imperialistic goals, and which still is a colonial power. So decolonized African states cannot have as an ally a contemporary colonial power. It sounds strange, really strange.
Indeed, and of course it also sounds strange that politicians from the Western democracies offer themselves voluntarily to one of the worst dictators in the world, Vladimir Putin, and are ready to spread his lies that war is peace and freedom is slavery. It was Olena Snigyr, who is a fellow at the Robert Schuman Centre for Advanced Studies at the European University in Florence, Italy. Thank you so much for this interview, Olena.
Thank you for the invitation, and it was my pleasure. Thank you.
And don't forget to like, to share, to subscribe to this channel, and wait for the next interviews.